Hey, Dr. Segan here, and we are going to continue our discussion of energy today, although we are going to begin shifting it towards biology. And this video is going to also mark a general shift towards biology for the next several videos, away from chemistry and physics and all that stuff that we had been talking about, the chemical reactions and energy and turbulence and heat, all those things. We'll be pretty much done with all that kind of energy, physics, chemistry stuff, and be transitioning into more biology and environmental biology. So today we're going to talk about energy and how it impacts ecosystems. So let's get right into it. So the main focus for this environmental science class, when we talk about biology, will be the subject of ecology. And ecology, for lack of a better word, is kind of environmental biology. It's basically the interactions between organisms, which are things like plants and animals and bacteria and fungus and all that stuff, and their environment. So that is what ecology is. And when we look at this picture on the right of this nice environment, this nice ecosystem, all these different plants and animals living together, one thing that connects them all together is energy. For example, we can think about, I don't know, this cattail here. And if you don't know what a cattail is, it's those things that live along ponds that kind of have like hot dog looking things growing at the top of them. But the roots are edible, actually, and lots of things eat these cattails. And so we can think about this organism in two ways. We can think about, well, how does it get its energy from? Remember, as a reminder, energy is what makes things move in our universe. So without energy, nothing moves, nothing grows. Even a plant that's not moving, it's still moving water from its roots to its leaves. It's moving sugars from its leaves down to its roots, all that stuff. It's still moving and it needs energy to do that. So if we're talking about this cattail, where it gets its energy from, it's from the sun. And if we're talking about what eats this cattail, this crawfish might eat this cattail and get some energy from the cattail. The fish might, or this frog might eat the crawfish, and so we can kind of see that the energy is moving through this environment, through this ecosystem. So when we talk about ecology, one of the kind of most important features when we're talking about all the different kinds of things that live on planet Earth is basically what their source of energy is. And we have two broad categories, although you'll see there's some additional labels that we can apply to organisms. And our two main broad categories are autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs, kind of a weird sounding word, but if you think of something like an autobiography, that's a book that's written about the person who's writing it. So you're writing a book about yourself if you are an autobiographer. And so auto refers to self. And troph, as you'll see, as we begin talking about things like trophic cascades and trophic levels, as we get to later slides, troph refers generally to food chains or food. And so when you put this together, it kind of refers to self-food or self-feeding, and an autotroph is an organism that produces its own food. And the more common name for this is a producer. So autotrophs are also producers. Examples of producers would be things like plants and algae, and they don't literally create their own energy. They get energy either from sunlight or from volcanoes if they're at the bottom of the ocean and you're a bacteria. And for this reason, even though they're not making their own energy, they can't make their own energy. They're not dependent on another organism for their energy or for their food, and so that's why they're referred to as self-feeding. Heterotrophs are kind of the opposite. They have to eat other organisms for food, basically. They have to eat something else for food. They can't make their own food. And hetero basically means opposite or different, so they're kind of different food or opposite food. And another word for this would be consumers or decomposers. So the distinction there is between consumers are generally eating living things and decomposers are generally eating dead things. And that can be a bit confusing because, I mean, look at this lion over on the right. We would generally call that a consumer, but it's not eating something that's live. That thing's dead right now. But this lion actually killed this thing to eat it, and that's why a lion is a consumer and not a decomposer. So decomposers don't kill the things that they're eating. They're eating old dead stuff, basically. And some examples of heterotrophs and consumers and decomposers would be things like animals and fungi. So earlier when I was saying everything was connected by energy and how energy moves through an ecosystem, and I was drawing these arrows between the sun and the cattail and the cattail and the crawfish and the crawfish and the frog, and I was kind of showing how the energy was flowing through an ecosystem. We have a word for that, and it is food chain. Food chains basically show how energy moves through an ecosystem. And make a note, because I see a lot of people always making this error, is that the arrow moves towards the eater, and the arrow represents energy. So each arrow basically represents how energy is moving. So when we're talking about grass and grasshoppers, grasshoppers eat the grass, so the energy is moving from the grass to the grasshopper. And we have some additional vocabulary here when it comes to food chains. We already covered producer. Those are things that make their own food. Those are autotrophs. Producers basically are the base of the food chain, we usually say. This isn't the perfect food chain. We'll discuss this decomposer here last. But things that eat producers, we call those primary consumers. It's kind of a strange use of words to call it a primary consumer. Generally in English, primary kind of refers to something that's the most important. All of these things are important, but primary is the first consumer, is really what it means. And those are things that eat plants, or in other words, those are things that are herbivores. Herbivores is a scientific term for an organism that eats plants. A secondary consumer is just simply the next level. It's the second consumer in the line, and it eats primary consumers. And generally we can call these carnivores, and carnivores are things that eat meat. So if you're eating a primary consumer, that means you're eating another animal, which makes you a carnivore. And as we move up beyond that, it goes to different levels. Tertiary is third, it's the next one in line. Those would be things that eat secondary consumers, and so on and so forth. When you get to the very top of the food chain, typically we call that the apex predator, and that could be on the fourth or the fifth level. Typically it doesn't get much further than that, and we'll talk about that in a second. One thing that's a bit strange in this particular diagram, whoever made it, I didn't make this, it's a bit silly. Decomposers will break down old dead stuff, but it's not like this mushroom will only grow on dead owls. So the idea that energy is flowing only from the owl to the decomposer is a bit nonsensical. Any of these things that die could potentially be decomposed by a fungus. So technically there should be arrows pretty much going like this. From all things to the decomposer, and technically the producer is mainly getting its energy. Technically the producer is getting its energy from the sun, and I really am quite the artist there, not really the decomposer. So don't be quite confused by this food chain. It was partially correct, it's just kind of messed up a few things with the arrows. All right, so now I'm going to bring up physics one last time here. We did mention something about the conservation of energy in previous lectures. That's the idea that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It's only moving from one thing to another, and we can see that clearly in a food chain. However, and I usually ask this question of my students. I like doing outdoor things. I like hiking around, and I spent a lot of time in Colorado growing up, hiking around in the mountains there. And pretty often you would see bears, as you're on a hike. And let's just say hypothetically, tragedy had fallen me and a bear ate me one day out there in the woods of Colorado. You could ask yourself, would the bear get all of the energy that I consumed for my entire lifetime? So would the bear, as it was eating me, get all of the food that I had consumed my entire life? I think intuitively you think, well, no, clearly not, right? It would only get a portion of that food, only a portion of that energy, and that would be the energy that was kind of actually in me at the moment and that had built up my body over time. That begs the next question of where did all of the other energy go? And the answer to that is that most of the food that I've eaten in my lifetime has gone into doing the various work that needed to be done around my body, like pumping my blood, moving my heart, moving my muscles, powering my brain, all of that stuff. And ultimately, all of that stuff generates heat. Remember, we mentioned that previously in other lectures, that pretty much all energy eventually will turn into heat one way or another, and the same occurs in biological systems. My body produces a lot of heat, but a lot of that heat kind of escapes out into the atmosphere as I'm moving around, working around, doing stuff. And so most of the food and the energy that I've eaten and consumed in my lifetime is basically just turned into heat in the environment. And so that bear wouldn't get all that. It would only get the energy that's in my body physically right now. And we say only about 10% of energy actually makes it to the next level of the food chain, which would be the bear here. He's above me on the food chain. We tend to show this 10% rule, as we would call it, in the form of an energy pyramid. And the 10% rule in ecology generally refers to only about 10% of energy makes it up to the next level of a food chain. And so if we have energy going into our bottom of our food chain where our producers are, only about 10% is making it up each level. So of all the energy that's going and shining onto our plants or our algae here at the bottom of this particular food chain, only about 10% is making it to the next level, to the things that are eating our primary producers, or in other words, those are our primary consumers. And then only about 10% would make it to the next level and the next level and the next level, so on and so forth. And so by the time you get to the top, there's really not that much energy left. I mean, we could even calculate it. If only 10% is making it to this level, that would be 1% here, 0.1% here, 0.001, and then by the time you get to the top, it's 0.0001% of the energy that basically the sun was providing. And all that other energy was basically lost as heat. And some of it that wasn't lost to heat would have been recycled back to decomposers. What this also tends to mean is that because there's so much more energy, and again, energy is kind of the equivalent of food and being able to do things as an organism, having your heart pump or moving sugars or moving water or whatever an organism needs to do, because there's so much more energy at the bottom, there tend to be way more organisms at the bottom as well of the food chain. And one way to think about that, if we're going to use this particular energy pyramid as our example, if you ever go to the beach or the ocean or the coast somewhere and you say, well, how many trees and plants and seaweeds and plankton do I think there are around, and algae and all that stuff that I can see? And pretty much that stuff is all over the place. You see it all over. Things like grasses, mangroves, and algae, they're all over the place. If you think, well, how often do I see things like, various plant eaters, so things like hermit crabs and clams and shrimp and things like that? Well, yeah, you see a decent number of those things. Well, how often do I see fish? Well, you can see a decent number of those, but probably not as many as there are hermit crabs and other things. And once you start getting into like the really, really big fish, like the really, really, I love fishing, and it's pretty rare that you actually catch anything that's very big. There's fewer and fewer and fewer of those bigger organisms that are higher up on the food chain. And, it's pretty rare that you might see a dolphin. And if you do see a dolphin, there are not that many of them. And the analogy kind of goes to other ecosystems, even if you haven't been to the ocean. If you go down to a local park, how often do you see trees and grass? You see that every day, everywhere, right? How often do you see a squirrel? If you're looking for them, you can probably see them. How often do you see a hawk or a snake or a fox? Those are going to be more rare because they're higher up on the food chain, and because there's less food and energy available to them, there's just fewer of them. So organisms at the top of the pyramid are more rare than at the bottom. All right, so while we're on the subject of food chains and food webs, we are also going to talk a little bit about populations and how populations of different organisms affect one another. Whenever I use the word population, all I mean is it's a group of the same kind of organism. That's what that word means. Generally, when we're talking about population, we are maybe referring to the human population. And yes, humans do have populations. We can talk about the world population of humans. After all, we are one kind of organism. So we can talk about the human population, but we can also talk about a population of a certain kind of fish. Like I think these are sardines in the picture. We could talk about populations of trees, we could talk about populations of grasses, we could talk about populations of fungi. All those things have populations, and some of these populations will basically serve as food sources for other populations. For example, a population of seals or sharks might eat this population of fish. And all of these populations actually impact one another through these food chain, food web interactions. All right, so let's just think of kind of an easy example of wolves and rabbits. So we know wolves eat rabbits, right? And we can imagine that if we have an environment with rabbits and wolves, if we have a whole lot of rabbits in our environment, lots and lots of rabbits, wolves are going to be really happy because they have a lot of food to eat. They walk around, they see nothing but rabbits, they can go catch them, they can eat. The wolves are happy, and when the wolves are happy, that means that they're going to be reproducing. They're going to be mating, and their children are going to have plenty of food. Their little wolf puppies are going to have plenty of food to eat because there's so many rabbits running around, and all the wolves are going to be happy and living well. And ultimately, that all has to do with energy. If there's abundant energy for the wolf population, then that means that they can make more wolf babies out of that energy and feed more wolf babies from that energy. And so if you have a really, really high population of rabbits, you're going to tend to have an increase in the population of wolves. Let's say hypothetically the opposite is true. Let's say instead of having an environment with lots and lots of rabbits, we have an environment with hardly any rabbits at all. And the wolves are going out looking for food and they can't find any food. And then because they don't have energy, their bodies begin breaking down. They starve to death. They don't have any wolf puppies. So when the population of rabbits is low, the population of wolves will tend to die off as well. So these two are kind of like linked together in the ecosystem, and it all has to do with energy. If you have lots of energy available to you, you can make lots of wolves, and you can all be happy. Not that it's going to lead to the death of wolves. So we call that a predator-prey relationship. And just to kind of summarize, when prey populations are really, really high, predator populations tend to increase. When prey populations are low, predator populations tend to decrease. And the opposite is kind of true if you reverse it. So, for example, if a predator populations are really, really high, so if we have an environment with lots and lots of wolves already in it, and you're a unlucky rabbit trying to make it in the world, you're going to get eaten very quickly. So if you have a high predator population, you're going to tend to have a very low prey population. And one way to kind of visualize this relationship is with this graph. This is a pretty standard predator-prey graph. And we can start at really any point, but let's say we're starting here at the top. So here is a point, blue line is rabbits, the orange line is wolves. So right here we have lots and lots of rabbits, right? So this is representative of how many rabbits are in the population. So in this zone here, we have lots and lots of rabbits. If you look down at the bottom, we don't have very many wolves, but because there's so many rabbits now, the tendency is that the wolf population is going to increase over time. As the wolf population gets really, really high, now all these wolves are eating all these rabbits, and that's going to tend to push the rabbit population down, and et cetera, et cetera. That's kind of how it goes back and forth with this relationship. This brings us to our kind of final point of the day, and which is kind of why all this matters. So why do we care about food chains and food webs? And the reason for this is something called a trophic cascade. Trophic, again, just refers to the idea of food or food chain or web. By the way, we haven't looked at one of these yet. This is a food web. This is a more realistic portrayal of what's going on in the environment. Unlike our food chain that we looked at earlier, not all creatures just eat one type of something. For example, if we look at this bird, it's probably not just eating a grasshopper. It's probably eating seeds and other types of insects too, who knows what. And so it's not just this perfect straight line or perfect circle. It's a messy web of interactions more like this. So we can begin talking about what would happen with these different populations. For example, if the rabbit population went up, this fox that's eating the rabbit is going to be happy, and so its population will also go up. However, if the rabbit population went up, the rabbit's got to eat something too, right? And whatever it's eating is going to decrease in abundance. So it's eating the carrots and the grasses, and these, because there's so many rabbits eating them, they're going to decrease in population. So again, we can talk about populations of grasses. If all the grass is being eaten by the rabbit, and there are lots and lots of rabbits, that means that all the grasses are going to be eaten like crazy. Okay, now we can start thinking, okay, well, if we have very few grasses, it's going to start affecting these other things in the ecosystem. For example, our grasshopper here, now it used to eat the grasses, but it's running out of food, so its population is going to decrease because it has no more food to eat here. And so you can see that even something that isn't, I mean, we were just talking about predator-prey, but we can actually begin having these indirect consequences once you start messing with some of these populations in an environment. Even our poor grasshopper that doesn't have anything to do with rabbits and foxes could be affected by what's happening with the rabbit and fox populations. And this tendency for the effect of one population changing, kind of altering and ultimately affecting everything in the food chain, is known as a trophic cascade. So any population change within a food web affects everything in that food web. So just our increase in rabbits ended up affecting grasshoppers and grasses, and that would also affect owls and mice and birds and grains as well. I didn't do all those interactions, but it would affect all of those things. That is called a trophic cascade. Our look at rabbits and grasshoppers also bring up a really important concept with food webs, and we will talk more about this when we cover evolution. It's the idea of competition. When two organisms eat or compete over the same resource, they are in competition. I think this word generally means something different in common English. Competition, if you're thinking about a competition, you're thinking about, two sports athletes competing against each other. And you're kind of thinking it's a physical competition with a winner and loser. And I think there is a certain carryover into ecology there. If we, for example, look at this rabbit and this grasshopper, And we see that it's both eating the grass. The energy is moving from the grass to the rabbit and the grass to the grasshopper. That means the rabbits and the grasshoppers are eating this grass. If there are a lot of rabbits and they're eating all the grass, like we were talking about, that's actually detrimental to the grasshopper. And so in some sense, if the rabbit is winning this competition, it's eating the grasses more, or it's finding the grasses easier, or whatever it is doing, then we would say it's kind of winning this competition for food against the grasshopper. And so what benefits the rabbit is actually hurting the grasshopper. We call that competition. And ultimately, we can talk about why this is all important. And the answer is that humans are inserting themselves all over the place into various food chains and food webs. For example, humans eat a lot of fish in the world. So let's say we are basically getting to the point where we're eating so many fish that we're not sure by the end of the century how many are actually going to be left. If you ever go fishing, I can tell you it seems to be more challenging to catch fish now than it used to be, because every time you see somebody fishing, they're removing fish from the ecosystem. So let's say hypothetically we are removing lots and lots of fish from this ecosystem, and as a result, the fish population decreases a lot. We can begin asking ourselves, well, what's going to happen to everything else? Well, if the fish population is decreasing, that means the krill population is increasing, but things that eat the fish, like maybe penguins or these seals, are going to decrease because they no longer have food to eat. And if they decrease, then now this killer whale all of a sudden is decreasing as well. If the krill population is increasing, that means whatever it's eating is going to decrease down here, and so on and so forth. So you can see that humans just inserting themselves into this environment and removing some fish is going to have all kinds of impacts on everything else. Some might be good, some might be bad, but it's basically creating a less stable system. And so that's part of the reason why we study food webs, and really why all of this stuff is important. All right, so that concludes our talk about energy and ecosystems, and pretty much for the rest of the year, we are going to be talking about either biology, so kind of environmental biology, and the sorts of things that are living in our world and why they're important, topics like evolution and some microbiology. So I think all those topics are pretty great and pretty fun. People like them and tend to like them better than the chemistry and physics. And it looks like I'm getting kicked out of the building. We got the cleaning crews coming around, so I'm going to get out of here. Take it easy.